Right then, hopefully you'll recall that we've defined a miracle as a specific event that would not have happened if only the natural order had been operating, where the natural order is understood to involve physical entities, their interactions, and the actions and interactions of animals, humans, and beings with such power." End quote. In addition, my thesis statement was that miracles, as defined, are possible events which are identifiable and distinguishable from natural events whose validity can be investigated by reason and historical inquiry. So in other words, I'm arguing that miracles are possible and investigatable. In the previous section, part 2, I presented a brief discussion on the problems of identification of miracles and the burden of proof. Therein, I concluded that miracle claims can be identifiable on at least 3 criteria, those being the event in question occurs in a religio-historical context, 2, the event in question is extremely unlikely and or inexplicable given natural law, and 3, there's adequate evidence that the event occurred equal to other unusual but accepted events, for example, authorial intent, traits of historicity, etc. Now, given these criteria, it was and is my view that we can identify an event as a miracle, and I provided one example of an event that would meet all 3 criteria. I also concluded that one who makes the miracle claim bears the burden of proof, but does so with no extra strings attached, as it were. All that is required is the one arguing for a miracle is that they offer evidence that is more likely than not. Having completed the preliminary steps into the possibility of miracles and their identification, I'd now like to move on to the objections against the possibility of miracle claims by their very nature. Perhaps the 2 largest arguments that have been raised and carried parallel to miracle claims are the objections from David Hume and Benedict Spinoza. Now, both men wrote quite detailed arguments against the possibility of miracles, and these arguments are still carried in a lot of philosophical textbooks to date. Given the prominence, then, and the detail of these arguments, no treatment of miracles should ignore them. In general, Spinoza objects to the possibility of the occurrence of miracles, whereas Hume objects more towards the identification of miracles. That is my goal right now, to address Spinoza's objections in this portion and then move on to David Hume's objections in part 4. In 1670, Spinoza argued that miracles are impossible and that they lack evidential value. The first charge that Spinoza makes is that miracles violate the very laws of nature. According to Spinoza, nothing happens contrary to the eternal and unchangeable order of nature. The second charge that Spinoza raises against miracles is that miracles are insufficient in proving God's existence. He supplements this objection by arguing that there is nothing to prove that a lesser being, for example a demon, could cause the event. And, further, that there is no reason to deny that a miracle claim is nothing more than a work of nature, yet discovered by man. For these 2 reasons, then, Spinoza argues that miracles are not possible and that they lack evidential value. What can be said in regards to Spinoza's objections against miracles? Well, in my research on miracles, I've come across several responses to Spinoza, and I would like to offer the following 4 thoughts in regards to his objections. I'll begin with his first objection, that is, that miracles are not possible because they violate the laws of nature and nothing happens contrary to the laws of nature. In response, I'd like to first point out that this mechanical and deterministic understanding of the laws of nature, whereby every event within the universe is depicted in terms of mass, motion, and the forces operating in these laws, is incomplete and false in relation to miracles. This understanding is incomplete in that the advent of quantum physics has introduced an element of indeterminacy into physics. In quantum physics, there is an irreducible element of this indeterminacy in the behavior systems described by quantum physical law, where those systems be subatomic or macroscopic. For example, consider the relations of kinetic with potential energies in classic and quantum physics. In classic physics, the kinetic energy of an elementary particle in relation to its potential energy is unable to move through a barrier. However, in quantum physics, if these 2 energies are close, then the particles tunnel through the barrier. However, what is interesting is that it appears to be entirely random whether or not similar particles breach the barrier, and where they end up is a matter of probability. Given this indeterminacy, then, and that macroscopic objects like bodies are composed of subatomic particles, natural law seems to be statistical in nature, wherein they describe what generally occurs and not what must occur. Craig comments that, quote, "This would appear to bring some comfort to the modern defender of miracles, for he may now argue that it is illegitimate to exclude a priori a certain event that does not conform to known natural law, since that law cannot be rigidly applied to individual cases. Given quantum indeterminacy, there is at least some chance of an event's occurring, regardless of how bizarre it might be," end quote. However, we need to be cautious here, as appeals to quantum mechanics, while pointed, cannot settle the problem of miracles outright, since not all laws are affected by quantum mechanics. This leads us to why Spinoza's first objection is also misleading. You'll recall that we defined a miracle as, quote, "a specific event that would not have happened if only the natural order had been operating, where the natural order is understood to involve physical entities, their interactions, and the actions and interactions of animals, humans, and beings with powers like our own," end quote. Note that we did not define a miracle as a violation of nature, like Spinoza does. There's a reason for that. Specifically, there are three major views of natural laws, those being 1. Regulatory theory, 2. Gnomic necessity theory, and 3. Causal disposition theory. In all three major views of natural law, it is simply false that a miraculous event are violations of nature. Let's take each in turn. The first theory, regularity theory, views laws of nature simply as the way things happen in the world. This includes both what happens regularly and anomalies. But on such a view of natural law, it would be absurd to think that such a law would view miracles as invasions into the natural law, since on such a theory, a natural law is just a generalized description of whatever occurs in nature, and it follows that no event which occurs can violate such a law. So rather than become violations to natural law, the miracles would instead become part of the descriptions, and thus on this account of natural law, Spinoza is wrong that miracles violate the laws of nature. The second theory of natural law is called gnomic necessity theory. This theory details the laws of nature as follows. The laws of nature are not merely descriptive, but also tell us what can and cannot happen in the natural world. Craig notes that this allows for conditional judgments. For example, if the universe's density was high, it would have retracted a long time ago. But again, on such a view of natural law, it is simply false that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. Craig notes, quote, "Since natural laws are taken to be universal inductive generalizations, a violation of a natural law is no more possible on this theory than on regularity theory. So long as natural laws are universal generalizations based on experience, they must take account of anything that happens, and so would be revised should an event occur, which the law did not permit," end quote. So again, Spinoza's objection that miracles are impossible because they break the laws of nature would be false here, on this second interpretation of natural law. The third and last theory of natural law is called causal disposition theory. According to this third theory, or interpretation of natural law, objects have natures or essences which stand in causal connections or dispositions with other things. Thus, on this view, natural laws are necessary truths about what causal dispositions are possessed by various objects. For example, salt has the disposition to dissolve in water, or objects with mass do not fall upwards. However, even on this third view of natural law, it is false that miracles would be viewed as violations to this understanding of natural law. If due to God's actions some salt failed to dissolve in water, the natural law is not violated because it is still true that salt has such a disposition. As a result of things' causal dispositions, certain deterministic natural properties exist in nature, and when such a property is not impeded by God or some other free agent, then we can speak of natural necessity, end quote. So again, on this third view of natural law, Spinoza still has not demonstrated that miracles violate the unchangeable laws. It is for this reason that it is inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. Thus, Spinoza's first objection that miracles are impossible because they break the immutable laws of nature is incomplete and false. C.S. Lewis illustrates this point well when he said, quote, "Miraculous wine will intoxicate, miraculous conception will lead to pregnancy, inspired books will suffer all the ordinary processes of textual corruption, and miraculous bread will be digested. The divine art of miracle is not an art of suspending the patterns to which events conform, but of feeding new events into that pattern. It does not violate the law's proviso, if A, then B. It says, but this time instead of A, A2. And nature, speaking through all her laws, replies, then B2, and naturalizes the immigrant, as she well knows how," end quote. Hence, this objection fails. But what of Spinoza's second charge, that is, are miraculous events insufficient to prove God's existence? Specifically, how can we know that a lesser being, like a demon, is not behind the events in question? Or further, can't we simply conclude that such an event would be nothing more than a work of nature not yet discovered by man? I have a few brief thoughts on these objections. First, the move to lesser beings seems to be rather odd and detrimental for the skeptic. If one truly wishes to engage in such an objection, then all of a sudden the critic abandons his naturalistic worldview and plunges headfirst into a theistic worldview. If we can make this move, and he's comfortable with that, then we're able to bring the full force of theological arguments that can be made in support of God's sovereignty over evil spirits, let's say, or the assistance of the Holy Spirit to help one differentiate supernatural actions in the world. Again, such beings are part of the furniture, so to speak, of the wider theistic worldview, so that no atheist today would seriously concede the gospel miracles and yet maintain they were performed by angels. In addition, there are criteria that are existent that help identify miracles. See Part 2. Therein, perhaps the most helpful criteria is the religio-historical context. Craig argues that, quote, the doctrinal context of the miracle makes it evident if the miracle is truly from God, end quote. The additional subpoint that Spinoza attempts to use to establish that miracles are insufficient in proving God's existence is also problematic. He argues that a supposed miracle can be nothing more than the effect of an unknown law of nature. However, if we take the case example provided in Part 2 of a miracle, i.e. the reversal of biological death, we can see the absurdity of this claim. Why don't we see people rising out of the graves often, for example? What process allows for decay to reverse? In addition, if the events in question occurs within a religio-historical context and is not a regularly occurring event naturalistically, then it would seem dubious and ad hoc to suggest that it is a natural event simply because we don't want to ascribe agency as a description. Lastly, Craig notes that it is important to note that Spinoza's argument, quote, does not spring from the nature of a historical investigation. Rather, the very eyewitnesses of the event could press Spinoza's objection. But in this case, the argument leads to an untenable skepticism. There comes a point when the back of skepticism is broken by the sheer reality of a miracle before us, end quote. Thus it would seem that Spinoza's second objection, like his first, is unconvincing and at times rather odd. Given the identification criteria in Part 2 and the very nature of miracles, if they exist, it seems that miracle claims could point to God. Thus Spinoza's twin objections of the immutable laws of nature and the evidential inferiority of miracle claims seem to be inconclusive at best and false and misleading at the worst.